Hi, my name is Irfan Fakir. I'm the project lead for the Graduate Workforce Graduate Project, and this podcast is for the South Asian History Month. We've got a special guest with us today, Jaffa, our technician.
Don't give up the day job.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name's Yunus Alam, and I'm head of Department Sociology and Criminology here at the University of Bradford. And with Irfan, I'm a chairperson of the university's Race Equality Staff Forum. So I've been invited to take part in this podcast today.
Come on,
Is
Alia.
it me next? Hi, I'm Alia and I work on the GWB project, and that's about it.
Hi, I'm Shireen. I'm the Student Engagement Coordinator for Student Union.
Jaffa.
I'm Jaffa. I work for the Career and Employability Services as an Information Advisor.
Jaffa also records and edits all the podcasts for the GWB project as well.
So we can all blame Jaffa if
If it goes
It's
belly
bad.
up, then it's blame Jaffa.
and if it goes well, that's because of us.
Because of it, yeah, cool.
Quite right.
So I think as a part of South Asian History Month, we were asked to record a podcast about what we thought what being South Asian meant to us.
Good food.
Good
It's
food.
gone deathly silent. Can I start with a slightly different question?
I know you're gonna. Yeah, go on.
Go on then.
Go on
Do you
then.
think you're that good?
Go on. Get it.
What
out
am I
your
gonna
system.
say?
Get it out your system.
No, what am I going to say?
I think you're gonna say, "Oh, it's a matter of fact. I'm just
What?
Asian." Would
No, I was going to say that.
Go on then.
Wouldn't have said that. I was going to ask our friends around the table, including you, what does South Asian Heritage Month actually mean to you? Do you see any value in it? In what way does it celebrate or acknowledge or do anything meaningful? Is it meaningful to you, I guess? Is it important? Alia, what do you think?
I'd say it's really important. I think growing up here, we don't get to learn a lot about our history, our heritage, like in schools and things like that, about British colonialism and everything like that. But I think that that's something that's becoming more, you know, the South Asian community and youth is becoming more, apparent with that, with our history.
Do you think people are getting more in tune and a bit
Yeah.
more aware and
Yeah.
taking the time to learn themselves, even if it's not being formally transmitted? through
Yeah, and there's a lot that
education?
I've seen on social media, on TikTok, on Instagram, about young people like kind of telling the history to other young people, just saying that this is actually what happened and we need to know more about it. So there's a lot more awareness, which I think is important.
I also think it's really important, particularly for not just South Asians, but like educating other cultures as well. But I always have this concern that are we just doing it as just another like gimmick sort of thing? Like there's a Black History Month as well. And are we just doing it just to tick that box as well, that we're South Asians and we've got a month?
Right, yeah.
But I think it also does give us the opportunity to like educate others and even ourselves, particularly British South Asians, because I don't think we're that educated. And I think it's a lot got to do with the history and what our parents and our grandparents had to go through. So I think it is important.
So when you're you three are probably the youngest. I'm probably the oldest, and Irfan's slightly younger than me, only slightly. So I know in my own experience, absolutely nothing around, not necessarily my ethnicity, but around India, Pakistan partition, South Asia more generally, whether it was Sri Lanka, when it was called Ceylon under the Empire. All that stuff, I got absolutely zero about that. I mean, I got to know about monarchs of England and Europe and the Treaty of Versailles and all this stuff, which is, it's important, but nothing beyond, and it seemed to be very narrow. So my question to especially the younger people, you guys, is, had things changed when you were at school? Did you get any?
I definitely didn't get any in school.
Okay.
I don't think there was a mention of it. not
So
in
were
the
you in a school in West Yorkshire?
Yeah.
Bradford? Okay.
In
So
West
that's the
Yorkshire.
same with you?
Yeah, same. And I went to like predominantly South Asian school as well. So
Yeah. So that there's an issue with curriculum,
Yeah.
maybe. I mean, I think most people know that.
Mm.
And there are always conversations about kind of decolonising curriculum so that it's more inclusive
Yep.
and more reflective of kind of global history rather than history told from particular perspectives. So there are these sayings out there like history is told by the victors or is written by the victors.
Mm.
So yeah, I think there's still a ways to go with that. What about you, Jaffet? When you were at school, did you get anything in terms of that stuff?
From the times that I was in the school, there was,
Misspent childhood, was it?
but there was nothing to do with South Asians. They were barely to say the school I went to. There were maybe 10 non-Asian students in the full school.
Really?
They still didn't teach anything about South Asians, nothing about Black History Month, nothing about like Africa, nothing. Just, it was literally Henry VIII, Queen Victoria, that sort of thing.
Right, okay. Was that the same with you, Irfan?
I think we did some work at school about partition, but that was about it.
Really? That was quite advanced for you.
But then then I did GCSE Urdu as well
Right,
in
Yeah.
school.
yeah. But it was taught in isolation in the way that French would be taught in isolation, except French history is also taught within the history
Yeah.
sort of lessons as
But
well.
then we had a good teacher, Urdu teacher.
Would kind of give you a bit more context.
Yeah, because he was a Sikh Punjabi, so he obviously he was quite old as well, so he kind of knew a lot about the history of
Yeah.
partition. So, and it was interesting, obviously, to hear him. But
But that was only an accident, right? I mean, it
that was
wasn't-
only because we were doing it GCSE Urdu.
But if it was another teacher who perhaps didn't have his kind of cultural knowledge, then
Maybe not.
you might have not had
No.
that transmitted. So it wasn't part of the curriculum. Is my
No,
point.
it wasn't part. Well, we did partition in history though.
All right. So that's I've never come across anybody who's done
Yeah.
anything remotely like that at school. So
But a lot of the stuff that I know comes from, obviously, me reading up on it, or like my grandparents were from India, so they lived it.
yeah. But that has I personally I think that's really valuable, and some of that knowledge is dying out with those people unless they're, as people get older, and they're no longer here, unless they're transmitting it through sort of oral traditions, telling subsequent generations. But even that has a certain kind of value compared to a more sort of verifiable and validated writing of history. So, for example, it's fine being told that stuff by your grandparents, but there is an absence of that telling within a formal educational context, isn't there? And that way, I think they have different weightings, Once something is taught in a school setting, it kind of validates it. And it's a bit like language. When I was at my primary school, this was in the era when kids were bused. So busing was about.
Did you get bused?
I didn't get bused. No, I was good Pakistani child because I could speak English. You see, I could speak English. I was like,
You know, I couldn't speak English properly until I went to school.
I still can't. Sorry. Until you went to school, you didn't speak. I don't know how I learned it. I either picked it up really quickly or I knew. Actually, one of our neighbours, when I was very young, she was a white lady and she used to look after me a lot as well. My mum was very good friends with her, you see. So, my mum picked up English through her and my dad could speak and write English. But what I was getting to about the busing stuff is like there were kids that were fairly kind of newly arrived into the UK and they had no English.
Yeah.
So I was one of those kids because I could speak both languages. I was used as a translator informally by teachers. So the teachers would say, tell this kid to do this. So then I'd say, do this, but I'd say it in, mid Priopatwadi or whatever. And then as soon as that kid became relatively proficient in English, there was no need for me. So sort of symbolically what that does is tells you that your language that you're using is only good when it's instrumentally used. There was no sort of formal integration of that language or valuing of it. So symbolically there's all sorts of things going on. And that's one of the things about this sort of South Asian history or heritage month. I'm not personally that convinced, really. I mean, I kind of go along with it to some extent because half the time the conversations you have with people or the things that you're asked to do, they might be interesting. But politically, I'm not entirely convinced that it's all that meaningful.
Meaningful to who, though?
Well, that's my point. It's
Like-
it's just like, we have these series of history months, as you were saying, like there's Black History Month in October. And I'm not saying that it gives people license to forget about that stuff for the rest of the year. And I get the premise that by having a kind of heightened part of the year, where we hopefully can proliferate that into the whole year. But I've not seen any evidence of that happening, really. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not convinced that I'm partly like one of you guys were saying, it's kind of tick boxy, perhaps, superficial, arguably tokenistic at times. So does South Asian Heritage Month equalise or have an impact on discrimination in education, in criminal justice, in employment? I don't think it does.
Who is South Asian Heritage Month for?
I don't know. I don't know.
Who is it for? That's the thing. Because I think it's really important that we know our own history.
Yeah, but
I should know my own history.
yeah, well,
I think that's really important. So then, if somebody says or writes something, I can disagree with them or say, that's wrong because this is the actual truth. A lot of people don't know that. So I think even a lot of South Asian people don't know their own history.
right. Yeah.
And that's why I think some of the stuff that comes out of South
But look, instead of having a South Asian Heritage Month, why don't we make that part of the curriculum so that kids are reared on this stuff? Rather than waiting for the accident of stumbling upon a podcast like this where people are talking about South Asian Heritage Month. Do you understand? So I'm talking about structures rather than
yeah.
these sort of add-ons. And I think it's a big sort of achievement that it's established. But, it's probably going to take quite a few years to sort of test its efficacy, whether or not it's sort of working or making any difference. At one level, at a sort of banal level, yeah, it's important because some kind of validation is going on. But I think, we really, it's been 70 years since post-World War II, ethnic minorities have been coming into this country. How much of their history, of their colonial history, is woven into the tapestry of a formal education, either at primary or secondary levels? Not a huge amount. I mean, I learnt most of my stuff, well, partly through, the kind of good fortune of my dad being quite sort of knowledgeable and literate when it came to all that stuff. But, when he was trying to transmit this knowledge, I was a young idiot kid who was not interested. But, some of it might have stuck. But I actually learnt most of my stuff when I did a degree. My undergraduate degree was on South Asian area studies. So I kind of learnt a lot about that, so it opened my eyes, I mean, I knew little bits and bats before that, maybe like most people, little bits and bats, but not the depth. There are all sorts of things that were happening in my parents' country, because it's not my country. I've been to Pakistan once, never been to India or anywhere else in South Asia, but there's still a kind of weird sense of belonging, attachment to it. I'm as much as British as I am as Pakistani. But there are all sorts of interesting things that you learn about that part of the world and, I suppose, colonial rule. So there's one example about partition. Upon partition, I mean, I don't know how true it is, but it sounds true enough to me, right? So, this was something that was taught to me as an undergrad. One of the lecturers taught me, gave a lecture about this. Is when the British left South Asia and they agreed the lines of partition and all that, you had West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan. East Pakistan later became Bangladesh, right? Prior to that, there was just the British Army in India, right? So they decided, right, we're going to have to divide the resources, more or less equally or pro rata or whatever. So, half the equipment for the Indian army, half of the equipment from the army sort of stock was given to the Indian army, as it was going to be, or to the Indian authorities, and the other half to the Pakistani authorities, right? So what they did was, in the example of shoes, the Indians got the left shoes, the Pakistanis got the right shoes. You understand? What was the point of that? So that sort of refers to to the kind of criticisms around British Empire and how they left, how they were, and a lot of scholars have argued that, the British tried to sort of scuttle. Basically, scuttling means, when you abandon a ship, you destroy the ship so that nobody else can take advantage of it. So that's what they were trying to do. And I'm kind of convinced that, that wouldn't be unsurprising. Those little bits of information have only come through formal education rather than something that was transmitted from a very early age.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Are you bothered about knowing your history, Jaffa?
No, I know bits and parts of my history, but I choose to go out and learn it. I got bullied in school because of the way I speak English. They used to say, "You're really whitewashed." But then when I was in school...
Whereabouts are you from? Are you sort of from Lancashire?
From Bradford.
Are you from Bradford? You've got a bit of a kind of Lancashire twang.
I used to get bullied for the way I speak English. Like, oh, you sound like you're whitewashed. But then I used to go around school with speakers with like Noor Jahan and like Gully Manak, and I used to be like, but you're like a mangi though. So I'm like, I can't win either way.
Yeah. So you like Noor Jahan?
Yeah, I'm really old school. Like, I love
Well, Noor Jahan is like my favourite female singer.
I love my old school stuff, but so I was caught in between, like, do I want to get called whitewash or do I want to get called a mangi? But I'd rather be there. See, like, all day, every day I've gone out and learnt stuff myself. Like in school they teach you Romeo and Juliet. I'd be at home reading Hiranja. Like,
right, yeah.
So it depends on what if you want to put in the effort to learn, go out and learn it yourself. Like, as far as South Asian Heritage Month, nobody knows what it is. We did a podcast about it last week. None of the students even knew it existed.
Right.
I didn't know it existed until my manager showed me the page and this is what it's about.
Are you guys bothered?
I think as a kid, I didn't really care. Maybe I'm bothered a bit now, but it's only because of what I'm doing as in my role, my job. I need to learn it. Otherwise, no.
So, yeah.
I might hear it on the like BBC Asian or the South Asian History Month. Okay, cool. And I bet you if I go out there and talk to students, a lot of them wouldn't even know. So I'm not really bothered because I don't see it makes that much of a difference, as you said. I'm glad it gives a platform to some people, arguably, but other than that, no.
I think, the more, like, the deeper I get into it, like the reading about the history and then hearing about the different stories, the more it hurts. I'm not.
So you're a bit of a masochist. You enjoy the pain.
It's like like the stuff that you hear, and then you're like, I can't believe that they did that.
Yeah.
But it happened.
Yeah. All sorts of stuff.
So you're like, bloody hell. Do you know what I mean? How can people be like that? But it's happened to like your ancestors, or do you know what I mean? Like, people actually died. So, and then what happens is, I'd come off it for, like, I might read through some stuff for a couple of hours, and then I have to put a book down and I have to forget about it for a few weeks and then go back to it.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with that part. But for me, it would be like, okay, I've learned the history. It just make me appreciate maybe my parents a bit more, my grandparents a bit more, because you kind of realise all the sacrifices that they made.
It's my turn.
Alia, because it's your turn to speak.
I value South Asian Heritage Month, but I mean, again, I wasn't that familiar with it until recently. The reason I'm familiar with it was actually because of Disney Plus, because Miss Marvel came out, which I love, and it's like the first Pakistani female superhero.
Is she American Pakistani?
American Pakistani, yeah. And they address the partition in that show and everything as well. Yeah, so it's...
Does she go back in time or something? No? I'm just curious.
She does. She goes back in time. And it shows,
Can she do that, though? Is that her superpower? Can she go back in time?
No, it's... her superpower is just, like, super strength and being able to...
Marvelous.
Yeah, basically. But yeah, that's how I became familiar with it initially. But I'm glad that it does exist, because I've seen a lot more since of, like people being educated for it. But again, I do agree that I don't think it's going to have a real impact. What needs to happen is, a change in curriculum, people actually being educated, and everything else.
Yeah. Well, I think by virtue of not having that you kind of continue with this worldview that puts valuable information in one world and less valuable information in another. So I think I don't know. I have, for me, it's very much a political issue. You know, it's not just something, oh, I feel like, you know, this is important because I like to have a rant about it. I just think there is a way of seeing the world. And I understand why it is as it is. But what frustrates me, I suppose, is there is a lot of rhetoric around all sorts of equalities, if you like. And invariably it's rhetoric, very little substance. And I guess, you know, at one level, maybe having a Heritage Month, South Asian Heritage Month, is a form of substance. You know, maybe it is that is substantive. Maybe it's a starting point.
Yeah.
It's been going, what, 3 years? 2 years? 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think another thing, even if they don't teach us in schools currently, but like that's where social media like kicks in. Because even if you're not educated at school about it, and kids, if you're on social media, you can come across it.
Yeah.
Like on, Alpha's gonna roll his eye, like on TikTok and stuff.
Yeah.
There is like stuff does come up on my like page saying like South Asian Heritage Month, and yesterday I was learning something about why a lot of South Asians have like diabetes and something related to the
famine.
yeah. So
Yeah,
It's related to the
famines have occurred.
Yeah, it's Maliha.
Maliha.
Maliha works in the reception.
We've just been talking about whether or not we think South Asian Heritage Month is meaningful and what it means to us.
Yeah.
Does it mean anything to you?
Yeah, being South Asian.
Hang on, shall I move this? Can you pick it?
Can you move that way then?
Yeah, there you go. Sorry.
Yeah, so being from a South Asian background, and then Bradford, South Asian influence, there's a lot of like cultural history here and immigrant history. So yeah, it does mean a lot.
You know what? I think this is a white country.
Is it?
Yeah, it is. Like, it was obviously this become less white because we've come here. But if you go to a place like Pakistan, they don't necessarily teach you to tell you about the history of Pakistan and how it was created. They don't teach you about colonialism as you think they do.
No.
And similarly, they don't have a white history month, or you know what I mean? British
No, because we
history.
don't have to have one,
Yeah,
because the history that's been written is mostly tacit anyway.
Yeah,
It's
but
already
even
there.
some of the laws that are in place in Pakistan
Yeah.
have been there since colonial
Yeah.
times. So, and I think I just think that I think there's just too much expectation. Because what's going to happen if even if people recognise that there's a South Asian Heritage Month, what's going to happen? What does that change? It just, you know more about your history, I know more about my history. Is it to teach English people or white people or the colonialists about what they did, or because they've forgotten what happened, or is it for us?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, at one level, it's because, you know, people need to do podcasts. I don't know. I don't know what the kind of result or the consequence of this is, or even what the intention of it is. I think people who sort of led on it. Somebody was telling me today, a BBC journalist, Anita Rani, was she one of the founders of South Asian Heritage Month?
There's a few.
There might be a few,
Yeah,
but
there's a few of
you know, so they've got very kind of laudable and honourable intentions around it. But you know, one of the things about plans and proposals and intentions is, you know, at some point you need to test them. You need to test the impact. You need to work out what's happened. And again, you know, it'd be unfair to say, well, you know, right now nothing much seems to have changed. Maybe stuff has for some people. I don't know. I would say that essentially it's a bit of a, I mean, this sounds really cynical. It's not exactly a PR exercise. I think it's just another way of demonstrating that we exist. That there is a South Asian presence in Britain and it's been here for this long, and that South Asian presence in Britain is because of a British presence in South Asia. Do you know what I mean? Were it not for colonialism, you and I, none of us would be here. arguably,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, if you kind of go through the flow of things and do a bit of quantum analysis, we wouldn't be here. So it's about that, really, and I think it's about acknowledging that reality and acknowledging the fact that, you know, whilst we have particular coloured passports and we have citizenship, we still have roots. You know, how well these roots are tended is kind of regardless, you know, it doesn't matter. They still exist. There's still something there. So those are about your heritage, but also there are roots in terms of the journeys we might not have taken, we may yet to take, but actually those journeys that our heritage is about, you know, our heritage in terms of our ancestors, our parents, grandparents, and so on. It's about acknowledging that, really. So I think it's a nice bit of sort of symbolism. It's a gesture. I think that's the word I was looking for, really. It's a gesture. It's not exactly an empty gesture, but, you know, from gestures can come great things. I'm not going to deny that. I've killed the conversation, it sounds like. Should we talk about something else? How often do you guys go?
Where
are you
ask
from?
That question actually. How often do you go back?
What's your heritage then? Which part of South Asia are your folks from, or whatever? Pakistani, right? So, what if you don't mind? What's your kind of story in terms of your parents, grandparents, whatever?
My mum's from here.
Right.
Dad's from back home. My granddad moved here when he was young, but I think that was to do with I think he joined the army. Because his brother went to Hong Kong to join one of their armies or something.
All right.
And one of the brothers come here. He started his family here.
Okay. So Bradford was the place they settled on straight away?
I think it was Preston, then Bradford.
Okay. And what was the work that your dad was doing when he got here?
Don't know about my dad, but my granddad was in mills.
Textiles?
Yeah, textiles.
Right. Sorry, I meant your granddad. Yeah. Okay. And what does your dad do? Oh.
Now he's a bus driver.
Right.
Don't know what he used to do. I don't really speak to him, so I don't really know.
What are you doing? I mean, you're working with Irfan, right?
In the same office.
All right. Okay, in the same office. Did you go to uni or anything?
No, I got chucked out of school at 40.
Oh, okay. Can I ask which school you went to?
Bellevue.
That's my old school.
Yeah.
I went to Bellevue Boys, right?
Yeah.
Thorn Lane.
Yeah, well, I went to Bellevue Girls technically. I went in the boys' school.
Hey,
I was at the girls'
you're a
school.
player. I think we have a baller in the room, right? Yeah, Bellevue Boys.
He had those mucha then as well.
Did you?
No, I didn't go there for that.
What is with that? I mean, I do admire them.
I'm just really desi. I don't know, just
Yeah.
really desi.
Much nahi to kuch nahi.
That's what they're saying.
You know, I like.
It's funny you said that. When I shaved my stash off, I was probably about 20. And you know, my dad was like, "You've brought shame into this." It was almost like that.
No way.
Yeah, it was like, what have you done, you know? But I was lucky because my uncle, my maternal uncle, he never had a stash. Very clean shaven.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, see, I think that's another thing. The tash is not our heritage. It's not a.
It's more about masculinity. Is it? What is it about?
I don't know. Appearance.
It's
Well,
about
not
masculinity,
basic,
but
granddads do have
Sorry?
ta-
Well, my dad.
do you think that's come from British colonialism?
I think to some
because
extent.
they had beards.
Yeah. So to some extent, because my dad had he had like a really small, kind of British aristocracy mustache. You know, really small. He looked like there was this English actor who used to be in 1950s, 60s something. His tash was exactly the same as his. So my dad's wasn't a great big,
No.
thing like that
the
or anything like that.
Jaffa's is special.
Yeah, so it kind of amongst my sort of elders, I suppose, there were moustaches, but they were quite modest things most of the time. They weren't like big, extravagant, things that needed a team of designers and buckets of beard oil to keep them.
But they like it.
No, just comb it. That's it.
Calm it.
It's dry
You don't
oil.
put curlers in it or anything.
Do that to it. My
Alright.
mum hates it though.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Everyone else loves it.
What about you, Shireen? No, but
I forgot what the question was because we're talking about
Tell us a
moustaches.
little bit about your sort of family history and, when you're...
I think it was my granddad and my dad's eldest brother who came first. But I know that they came for a couple of years, but then they went back to Pakistan.
Okay.
And then my granddad passed away. But I don't think my granddad had the intention of coming back anyway. But my uncle did. So my uncle came. And then I think in them days, they used to like adopt kids from Pakistan. Is it something like that?
They used to pretend that that's their brother.
Yeah.
Or their son.
So that's how like a lot of my like my dad's cousins came over, and my dad came over just because his brother was here, and they just decided to stay here.
Yeah.
And my grandma came quite late. I think she was in her 40s or something, just because she was alone in Pakistan, so they brought her over here as well.
Sort of, was that like the 1970s or something, probably?
Probably, yeah.
And whereabouts are you from then, Shireen? In Bradford? Are you from Bradford?
I'm from Bradford, yeah.
Okay. And...
From Pakistan, Azad Kashmir.
Okay, I wasn't going to ask that, but I was going to
Okay,
ask you. No. I'm just curious about the sort of schools and stuff you went to.
I think I went to a very typical Bradford school full of like South Asian and Pakistani majority. And one thing about like when you talk about culture and stuff, even though our school was like 96% South Asian, Pakistani, all probably from Azad Kashmir, Mirpur, there still was this almost like embarrassment of being brown, even though we were in a school full of brown people. So embarrassment meant like if you've seen wearing salwar kameez and stuff, it was like, oh my god, she's such a, I don't know if I can use that, but such a mangi and all that. And even like there was a couple
What
of
does
kids.
mangi mean for people who aren't?
It's
who
like
aren't familiar?
it's meant to be an insult that you're really
What
like.
does that mean though?
I
What-
don't even know
you
myself,
even
to
know
be
what it
honest.
means?
No.
What does it mean?
Mangeter.
Mangi. What does mangeter mean?
Freshie.
What does freshie mean?
No, mangeter is like if...
An immigrant, basically.
I'm just well, it's somebody who usually comes over for the express purpose of marriage.
Manage, yeah. But it's
Oh, I
been
didn't
turned
know.
into something else.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so then people would say mango, mangi, and it's become pejorative, hasn't it? It's become a sort of insult.
Yeah.
And first time I heard freshie was people in Birmingham were all saying freshie, freshie. What?
Calling it you?
Sorry?
You're calling it you?
Yeah, probably. I don't know. So anyway, yeah. So I know what you mean in terms of
Yeah.
even.
And
though
it was like, even like with girls, if they came with like oil in their hair and a plait, or you were gonna get bullied for the rest of your school like journey and stuff. But I feel like nowadays it's changed a bit, because even like if I go like Bradford College and stuff,
Yeah.
they're quite. When I look at the youngsters there, they wear Asian clothes and listen to Asian music. And there was this thing of like even language. A lot of my friends don't know how to speak like Punjabi, Urdu anyway, but even those who did, they would say they don't know how to speak Punjabi just to...
kind of out of embarrassment.
Yeah.
Can you speak?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
I think there was a time where people were embarrassed of their heritage, but I think now they're reclaiming.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think.
There's a movement.
I mean, I didn't know it was still kind of the thing in your generation when you were at school, but when I was at school, my school I went to, Volume Boys, it wasn't 96% South Asian or even BME. It was probably closer to 50-50. And at the time, my friends at school were kind of African Caribbean, kids from Jamaica, Barbados and all that. I had some Sikh friends, some Indian Hindu friends, Eastern Europe. My best friend was actually Polish. I had friends from Ukraine. So it was kind of much more truly sort of diverse rather than just 2 or 3 ethnic blocks. And at that time, if you weren't white and your classes were predominantly white, so believe it or not, I was in the top set, obviously a mistake, but I was in the top set, and the majority of the kids in the top set were white, with about 4 or 5 sort of exceptions, and those exceptions were kids who came from professional backgrounds. There was a Syrian kid, the Pakistani kids, and their dads were doctors or bankers and things like that. Volume Boys was pretty kind of sort of decent. Not that it's not. I mean, it's an academy now, probably, isn't it?
I think the year after I got chucked out, they turned it into an academy.
Yeah,
And then a year after
Lister
that,
Academy
it
or
went
something.
to It's a mixed school.
All right, yeah. But at the time, like I said, you know, but for me, being one of the minority in this top set, and when you went lower down the set, the more brown it became, right? So, you know, in the A form, majority white, B form, slightly lower, sort of 50-50, C form, mostly non-white and white working class kids, right? In the top set, I had friends who were very middle class, you know, white kids. But for me, in order to fit in, I had to kind of emulate them, be like them, buy into their narratives, you know. And at that point, you know, I slowly learned to overcome the sort of the contradictions, you know, because I'd have white friends who would say things like blah 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 packies, blah 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 nignogs, whatever, and then they'd look at me and they'd say, yeah, but you're all right, you know, or they'd say no offense. And, you know, at that point, when you're 15, 16, you kind of, well, I didn't really know much better, but I slowly learned to evolve and appreciate and understand what was going on. So, you know, that for me was very formative, and it became even more important when I entered the world of work. But in those days, what you talked about, kind of embarrassment about your own culture, about your own identity was like, I mean, it's embarrassing now that I think about it, you know. I'm embarrassed about being embarrassed back then, and why would I be? But again, you know, that everywhere was whiteness.
I know, like my dad, like your journey is kind of similar to my, not journey, but your school experience. But my dad used to say to me that you guys are really lucky that you go to a predominantly Asian school, because he goes, where he went, there was literally only like 4 Pakistani boys. Like in,
which school did you go to?
I can't remember, somewhere in Wakefield.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so, and you remember, he goes, I remember starting and people used to just bully you just for being brown. And he's like, you have to stick your ground. And the only reason, I think it was in whatever year, after 2-3 years, that he wasn't getting bullied was because he was like good at football. So people wanted him to be in the team. That's the only reason why he didn't get bullied. But even whilst, because my dad likes a taxi driver as well, he goes, even when I used to be a taxi driver, there used to be a lot of like racism, and I think they use the term like Paki bashing or something like that. Yeah, and he goes, you guys as in your generation doesn't have to face that, and I think you need to appreciate, like he says to me that you need to appreciate it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm sort of the same age as your dad, but yeah, I grew up and Paki bashing was a thing.
Yeah.
And you know, people say Paki bashing, and people call anybody who wasn't white Paki.
Yeah.
You know, anybody who's sort of brown, might be an Indian, Sikh, whatever. You're all Pakis, and you're gonna get, you know, battered or whatever. So about you, Adia?
So on my mum's side, my great grandparents came to this country. But they went to India, then they went to Barbados when my granddad was born. Then they came to this country when he was a kid.
Okay.
So it's very much, you know, the kind of history there's a bit lost, you know, in terms of like what happened in India.
When did they go to Barbados?
I'm not sure what the year of I don't know when my granddad was born either, to be fair.
All right. Okay.
He's in his 70s now.
So was he born in Barbados?
I believe he was.
All right, okay. Because toward the end of the 19th century, you know, there was a period of indentured labour where people from, for example, India, it was only India then, were sent out to help. They kind of basically got a bit of money and sold themselves for a number of years. So that's why in places like Trinidad and Tobago, there's quite a big South Asian heritage population, you know. So I'm wondering whether it was sort of coincidental with that. But anyway, sorry I interrupted your flow.
So they came to this country, then his siblings were actually born here. I think my great-granddad worked in the Cadbury's factory, and that's what he did here.
Is that in
Birmingham? Yeah.
Bourneville.
Yeah. And then, so my mum was born here. On my dad's side, my granddad came over, and he was just a tradesman. So he would, you know, I guess, like importing goods from India here or something like that.
Okay.
But he was a businessman. And my dad was born here as well.
Okay, fair enough.
So both my parents are from Azad Kashmir. My dad came.
Whereabouts in Azad Kashmir?
So my dad's from a village called Dangdeol, and then I'm from Dangdibola.
All right, I think I've heard of it.
Yeah. So my dad came to England in like the 60s with his dad, and then we used to all work in like textile mills
Yeah.
and like factories and stuff.
So are you and your parents sort of settled in Bradford as well?
Yeah.
I didn't ask you that. Where are you?
So my mum was Birmingham, my dad was Dewsbury.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so my
He's
granddad
still
came.
in Dewsbury, right?
Batley, but yeah, basically Dewsbury.
So yeah, but you're Bradford.
Yeah, I'm from Bradford. Yeah, born here, raised here, but my parents are from.
Yeah.
Yorkshire.
So your dad worked in textiles.
Yeah.
And how was your sort of educational journey here?
So it was okay. Like there was diversity. There was a bit of like embarrassment as well of like having like oily hair or plaits. That was a bit of a.
What about things like headscarves? You know, what the girls? I mean,
Not many girls wore hijab. I didn't wear hijab.
Right.
In primary school.
What about secondary school? Comprehensive.
Secondary school. I don't know. It was like an expectation for like girls from primary school. Like, oh yeah, when you start year 7, we'll start wearing hijab. It
Is
was
that
like
when you're 12, right? 7 is
Year
12.
7.
Year 7 is
Yeah.
about 12.
That was a bit of a
Yeah.
thing, a couple of years ago.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
like, a lot of girls like when we start year 7, we'll start wearing hijab. Yeah.
Okay.
And some were forced to wear it.
What, they told you that?
No, not me. Like
No, they
people-
told some of your friends,
Yeah.
girls at school, told you
Yeah,
that
like-
their parents or their
Yeah.
brothers or whatever forced.
expectation of like forced.
Oh.
Yeah.
What about, so, I mean, that's a slightly separate issue in terms of headscarf, but in terms of your day-to-day, are you guys quite comfortable in terms of wearing whatever the hell you want?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously,
I wouldn't say I
Jaffa is
was.
with that moustache.
I think it's hard
Can
for
I keep calling back?
for girls, especially to, in Bradford, it's very easy to be modest and dress as a Muslim or South Asian, like in traditional clothing. But outside of Bradford, definitely not.
What do you mean outside? You're talking about largely sort of white areas? Is that? Or,
Even just going into
What Batley, where you live?
yeah. So I mean, so I went to Heckman. I went to school in Heckman Wyke, and I
Is
was
it Heckman White Girls Grammar? Is that where you went?
no, it's mixed, but it's grammar. It's a grammar school.
Yeah. It's on the right-hand side as you're going up that hill, right?
Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of. I guess there's a mixed community there. There's a part of it where it's very much a Pakistani community, and then there's a very white community there. The white people are very racist there, I would say. Obviously it depends on the people, but there's a part of it which is quite racist, and I've been racially abused like multiple times there.
Really?
But it always happened. It happened after I started wearing hijab, which was when I was 16.
Okay.
So that was
like the
it was and
thing.
it was as soon as I put it on, I noticed like the way people would look at me differently and everything like that, whether it was on public transport or I go into Leeds a lot as well, so that was a big difference because there's more of a white community there.
So do you get the same sort of stick in Leeds? Is that what you're saying? Is Leeds just
It's not-
similar?
It's not as bad, but I would just say that I noticed it more when I put a
Yeah,
hijab. It's more like looks, but in terms of like
Ah,
actual racial abuse, that's like verbal or physical, it was definitely more in like Heckman Wyke or
But
even
you
in.
don't get any of that in Bradford ever?
I've never had racial abuse in Bradford, no.
Any of you?
I'm fortunate enough to say that I've never
Really?
experienced like any racism.
You,
Shireen?
you have Shireen. I don't be
But,
telling me this story.
Yeah, in Bingley. Very
Yeah.
far out.
So what happened?
You
What
can't
was
go.
it? Were you walking or you driving or what?
No, I was walking actually. I was on a placement at uni and it was a bit out of the blue. It was just like an old, I think she was probably drunk lady just randomly saying, "You Paki." I don't know if I can say it out loud now, but "You Paki," this and then. Do you know, you always think like, I'm going to say this and I'm going to say that and I'm going to
You
react
just
like
kinda
this.
freeze.
But when it happened, I just
You
stood there
stunned
like,
you.
oh my God.
Shireen went home thinking, oh, I should have said this.
Looked in the mirror, I was like. But in terms of like, I don't know if your question before was in terms of clothing or in terms of hijab. I think clothing nowadays, our generation, it isn't an issue. But I've heard stories of maybe people 15 years like before who are in their 40s maybe now or something, that they couldn't wear like Western clothes. They had to wear like South Asian like salwar kameez and stuff, and obviously if you went to maybe like a white school, that became a problem because you don't want, obviously as a kid you don't really want to stick out.
Mm.
but then if you're like dressed differently and your hair's different, you are sticking out. But I can't.
understand what you're
Yeah,
saying.
but the thing is, I can't comment it too much
So-
because thank God I didn't have to go through it.
I don't believe that you
But-
were putting Dale in your
I wasn't doing it.
like Jasmine or
No, I wasn't
Telling
doing.
other people's hair, you know.
I wasn't doing it, but there was girls that had to go.
because Jasmine always got quite
Particular
a scent.
smell.
A smell.
Yeah. You can smell it from a mile away.
Yeah.
It wasn't me, but I'm just saying it was like a select few
So
girls who had to.
it's kind of just, I mean, everything's subjective, right? But drawing on what you've just been saying, the kind of word that comes to my mind is integration. I mean, that's one of the things. So, do you feel sort of integrated, and what does integration mean to anybody? Do you know what I mean? What about your family?
I think anybody coming from outside into Bradford would have to integrate.
So Bradford's a world apart. Is that what you're saying?
It's a bit of a bubble, to be honest with you.
What does that? What do you
Are
mean?
you
Like-
from Bradford?
No,
No, is he?
I'm not from Bradford.
He has to have a passport to get into Bradford.
You're kind of lucky in a way, you know. You don't have to deal with all that kind of stuff. Like my missus, she's told me like when she goes to like the supermarket or whatever, she's going about her business, and she wears Western clothes, nobody really cares. You know what I mean? She just goes about her business. But the minute she puts on Asian clothes, they think she's a bit dumb. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They treat you like you're a bit thick because
Yeah,
you can't
yeah.
speak English or something.
Yeah.
So there is that kind of thing, and I've had it where people, you know, sometimes, like, you know, you might work here in a university, but when you're outside at work, I
You're
kind
just
of dress like a tramp in it. So, do you know what I mean? I just tracksuit bottoms or whatever. You know what I mean? I'll go out, whatever. I never used to do that before, but I do now. I just go out in whatever I'm wearing, tracksuit bottoms, t-shirt, whatever, and then people just think, oh, you go to the supermarket and stuff. People think you're like you know, I think maybe they just think you can't speak English or something like that. It's
Because what? It's the combination of your ethnicity and what you're wearing. Is that
Yeah.
what you're saying?
weird. Yeah.
For you as well?
Yeah.
I mean, you don't go to the supermarket. I mean, maybe you do it in sort of male salwar kameez, do you?
Yeah, I'll go.
Yeah.
I'll go
Yeah.
sometimes. I don't wear the jubba dress, but
Yeah. But the salwar kameez you might do.
I might go as well.
And does that kind of elicit that sort of response when you talked about your wife?
My wife definitely has
Yeah.
had that.
I mean, I know younger people, sort of your age, who've had real problems in Bradford. You know, I mean, in the past it's been around particular moments, you know, so when there's a terrorist issue, for example,
Oh, yeah.
and there's a suspicion that it might be Islamist.
Okay, thank you for your
Thank
time,
you.
Maliha.
Thanks, Leah. That seems to correlate with sort of racial hatred or hate crimes or whatever. You know, there is that. But I remember, you know, talking to a young woman, and she worked in a store, one of these clothes stores in town, and there was a white person with a load of shopping refused to be served. She said, I'm not going to be served by her. She's a terrorist. Because she was wearing a hijab, you know. So, that, I mean, it does go on. I mean, I you know, quite a few years ago, over a decade ago, 15 years ago probably, I did some research around young men, Pakistani heritage men in Bradford. And they were all happy about Bradford. It's that bubble. They were very comfortable. It was like, you know, I mean, there were guys who were talking, they said, look, you know, I don't get any drama really. People give me a look because I'm wearing a beard. You know, I can kind of practice my faith relatively comfortably. I can kind of be who I am. You know, there are shops, you know, I can get halal food, whatever, all the infrastructure's there. So people generally quite comfortable, but that kind of then speaks to a point about insularity. And, you know, you and I have had conversations in the past about the fact that people not need to, but, you know, things might be different if people develop their cultural capital, really, you know, to spread their wings a bit. And that does happen, you know, people do kind of move out of the city, right? And they go find work or career down south, London, Birmingham, wherever. So that does happen. But I think Bradford's very comfortable for a lot of people, you know. I mean, I like Bradford. I've born and brought up in Bradford. I've been working in Bradford all my life, lived in Bradford all my life.
I feel like a League of Gentlemen, isn't it?
Local, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it local?
Place for local people.
It is a local place for local people.
Yeah.
But there's something weirdly Bradfordian even about people who aren't indigenously Bradfordian. Do you know what I mean? People who aren't ethnically white, who are still Bradfordian, they'll still consider themselves, they're quite proud about the fact that they're from Bradford.
And people who are not from Bradford, they're proud that
Yeah.
they're not from Bradford.
Yeah, maybe everybody. Yeah.
I'm
people-
proud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of local thing, isn't it?
But you've had that experience. You went to work. Ali did a placement, yeah, and not far from where was it?
It was in Batley.
Your placement, yeah.
Yeah, my placement. Yeah, PPG. It was Birstall, Batley, Kent.
Tell Eunice about your experience.
So it's very close to. It's kind of on the border of the very white area and very Asian area, and it's a whole factory.
Birstall.
Birstall, Batley. Yeah. The factory has the employees were all white as well, either all white or Eastern European, but white complexion. And in the office, I was the only Asian Muslim girl that wore a hijab or anything. In the whole finance team, actually, I was the only Asian Muslim girl that was there. And it was just very strict. It's like the people there weren't bad at all. They didn't show me any racism, but it was a bit of you can tell that when it came to the recruitment process, there was obviously something not right, especially considering in the factory as well. You don't need qualifications to work in the factory, and there's a lot of people
Are you
in
talking
Batley.
about the recruitment for people working on the factory floor, not your recruitment?
I think the whole kind of company itself
It was
seemed
very wide.
equally.
Yeah.
And one thing in particular that used to annoy me was they would give out like leaflets or send out posters on emails, and there'd be a hijabi, there'd be like a black woman,
It's quite
and then
diverse
like
looking.
and I'd never seen these people before in my
They
life.
didn't exist.
They didn't exist.
Yeah.
They were just there for the picture, but
Stock photos.
there wasn't a single other hijabi in the whole factory. There was literally thousands probably working in that whole factory. It's a huge site. I was the only one.
The thing is, though, Eunice, we've had this conversation before. It's so insular that you don't have experience of outside of Bradford, and then when you do go work in those places, it's weird,
Yeah.
and then you don't get it.
Yeah. I mean, when I've spoken to people who've sort of operated outside of Bradford and the BME heritage, the conversations are usually around emulation. You kind of have to play the game. You kind of have to learn to get in with the banter, to do the stuff, the rituals, buy into the kind of language and the narratives within these workplace cultures. So, but that's how people survive. That's the kind of survival strategy, right? And that's the survival strategy that doesn't operate where they can be themselves properly, So it's like, when I was saying I was at school, you might laugh, but when I was, third form, I must have been about 13 or 14, right? I first got into, because all the white kids in the room, right, in the class, there were no black kids. Like I said, a handful of non-white kids, South Asian, Middle Eastern, Indian, whatever, right? And the rest were white. Majority of these kids, right, the music there, so music is a great sort of, unifier, it brings people together, right? Majority of these kids, right, they listen to either heavy metal or stuff that, still kind of makes me not exactly gag, but I'm not a fan of it, the Smiths and these sorts of bands, right? Very white kind of 80s guitar based rock, and then 70s based sort of heavy metal and heavy rock, right? Meanwhile, all the kids I'd grown up with in Manningham, they were in the B form, right? They were alone. And these guys were listening to reggae, ska, hip hop as it was emerging, and that was my music. But in order to fit in, I became a heavy metal person. For like 2 years, I was into Rainbow, Deep Purple, Scorpions, all this stuff, and some of it was all right. If I'm honest, it's helped me.
Did you even like it?
Some of it I did. I kind of
man.
became a bit of a Meatloaf fan.
No.
But then by the time I was 15, I didn't exactly reject it. That became part of my kind of cultural repertoire. I knew all the references. So when people talked about Def Leppard or, whatever. I could kind of...
You heard
Oh.
about these bands, yeah.
A couple of them, not all of them.
But by the time I was like I said, 15, 16, then I started kind of going back to my kind of roots. I once again went back to, two-tone, the Specials, ska music, reggae, Bob Marley, and then especially hip-hop was like huge. It became a huge part of my leisure, But I did all that to fit in. Do you understand? I did all that to fit in with that context, and that context for me was permissively white. So I knew that I was never going to be white, but I could act white. So I had a Yorkshire accent. My accent is kind of Yorkshire now, probably, but it was like proper Yorkshire accent, like, you know what I mean? It was like that. I was like him, like he was being accused, right? I passed for white in terms of my voice.
Your telephone voice.
Yeah, I had a telephone voice kind of thing. And I think that's what happens. I think people are quite conscious of the fact that, you know what, if they turn up, they're working at some big merchant bank or something, and it's all white, or even if they're working in a factory, it's all white. If they turn up with their tiffin box with andi roti or paratha and samosa, they are going to have a hard time, right? So they'll have a pasty or they'll bring the sandwiches. And, some of that I carried with me. When I worked in a mill, when I was younger. I worked on night shift. And first couple of nights, I took sandwiches with me. And there were all these mame and chachi and, these older men who've been working there for decades. And they're looking at me and shaking, like, you kid, what are you doing? Come and eat with us. And they'd make me eat with them, share their roti. And I clicked, and I'm like, yeah, these sandwiches aren't doing anything, Cheese salad sandwich, what's that going to do? You need proper food, innit?
What did you have for school dinners?
Not at school, I'm talking about when I worked in the mill.
Were you not used to eating sandwiches at school?
No.
What did
I
you
never had school dinners.
You went home for roti?
No, just didn't. I used to get dinner money, but I used to buy cigarettes with it, so.
I used to go home dinners back then.
Yeah, no, school was too far for home dinners
Yeah.
where we lived, but yeah. So I think that sort of thing is, I don't know, and people just not embrace it, but it becomes normal, doesn't it? It becomes the stuff of work. That's just work.
Do you feel like you've got like two personalities?
I used to. Now I kind of don't care. I am kind of what I am. I mean, I talk like I talk, but I talk like this to my kids, to my family, to my friends.
I feel like sometimes a lot of people have two personalities.
Is that kind of like that imposter syndrome?
I don't know, but I think they have to act a certain way at work and then different.
Yeah, I mean,
I've lived two lives. Like you've got your work life, innit?
Yeah.
And then you've got your life like with your parents at home.
Yeah.
You don't have the same, do you?
I don't know.
I'm more or less, dude. Well, you censor yourself a bit when you're going to work.
Yeah.
I
think that's it. Yeah.
Change who you are. I don't change who I like.
Like I don't talk about flipping handy roti at work.
Well, yeah.
We have different conversations.
Yeah, exactly. But that's contingent on the context. Isn't it? You're not going to go home and start talking to your missus about, data in the latest report or anything, right? What does she care about that? It's like, you bring the money home and shut up. And not anything else. You know what I mean? You need to pay the mortgage or whatever, right? And she does as well, probably. I don't know.
Yeah. But no, growing up, your college and your uni life was different to your home life.
Yeah, but I would say
Like, there's some stuff that you wouldn't have told your parents as well.
Oh yeah, but that was all to do with kind of norms and.
Them day rules that you used to go.
Yeah, those were cultural expectations. Some of them dominated by Pakistaniness, I suppose. Some of them dominated by your faith or your religious beliefs, whether or not you live by them. So that was slightly different terrain, I think.
Serena, are you allowed outside after 9 o'clock?
What's outside?
Back in the day, they used to have these day do's because guys and girls won't be allowed out after college.
I think one thing I hear a lot is from like maybe my cousins or like older, they always say, oh, we couldn't do that when we were your age. We couldn't. Even my dad said it to me, like, oh, even I couldn't do that at your age. So, I don't know.
Well, like, I mean, there was there weren't those things to be done in my day. There were no dessert shops, for example. Do you know what I mean? So dessert shops now, they're not just about the food.
No, I think it's about like staying out. Like I do have. I want.
Ice creamers with the van used to come.
Yeah, that's the only time I got ice cream.
Or onion eat or something. I don't know about his childhood. Please don't generalize to
But I
everyone.
think there's so many more options now, and because there's people like yourself,
Yeah.
your generation, and in many instances, at least one of your parents is British born or British heritage, or been through the British system, and they've kind of got a British enculturation. They're slightly more forgiving than perhaps my parents might have been. Do you know what I mean? They're less restrictive.
I agree with that, but I've like some of my friends, even their parents who are both from Pakistan are more forgiving and let them do things than their parents who are like born
From here.
here. I don't know if that's something got to do with their own childhood and them messing around and them thinking that their own kids are gonna do it.
That's more to
But-
do with the kids know how to spin circles around their parents because their parents aren't from here.
No, I just mean, yeah, maybe. No, but I feel like, you just generalize that if your parents are from Pakistan, they'll be more strict compared to being like British born. But that isn't always the case because I've seen like the opposite happening. So,
I don't know. Both my parents were from Pakistan, so at the beginning they were. Back in the days. Do you remember? You probably remember this. Back in the day, no one used to wear a hijab or a.
That's right.
Do you remember?
Yeah, it was Jila.
It was like
the
Junia,
Bata.
little Junia, or
The Bata.
yeah, that was it.
And it was
then
like, yeah.
I think it was like and between sort of the 80s and 90s, there's a massive
No,
change.
it was later than that. I'm
Do you
pretty sure. Yeah, it was like late 90s. The hijab became a thing.
Because I remember when I went to Pakistan, and I came back, and I noticed straight away things had changed.
Yeah,
Something had changed,
yeah.
and I was only away for
And
a year.
that I mean, if you're South Asian and Muslim, it became a thing. And again, it was because of events that were happening in Britain. There was the Rushdie affair, and that kind of politicised and mobilised a generation of people, men and women, young men and young women, who weren't like their parents. Because their parents, my parents, generally speaking, that generation had a reputation of being good immigrants, i.e., South Asians predominantly were good. Within the discourse, the ones who weren't good were African Caribbeans. They were they were painted as and represented as either, people did lots of research around this in ethnic relations, but they were sort of demonized in the way that Muslims would be demonized 30, 40 years later, So at that point, the South Asian Britain was passive, hardworking, honest, corner shops, taxi drivers, bus drivers, working in the mill, all that stuff. Whereas African Caribbeans, they're all either pimps, yardies, muggers. That was the dominant discourse. It was completely, and it was reflected in policing stats, reflected in unemployment, various forms of deprivation. So it was basically two different types of racism going on with two different types of groups, right? But then, post-Rushdie, post-95, there were riots and disturbances in Bradford in 95, and then there was the rise of organisations at global level like Al-Qaeda 1995, they've been kicking around even before that. There was an assertive, confident, mature, educated, British, Western educated Muslim. And they, unlike their parents in the majority of cases, they could connect with the text themselves. They didn't need to go to the Imam. They didn't need to go to a sheikh or a religious scholar. They could look at these texts themselves and they could interpret it as they saw fit, So there was a kind of a bit of a reclaiming of a faith identity. Wasn't there before when I was a kid. But, there were people in the late 90s and into now. And it's a weird reclaiming because some of the reclaiming is claiming stuff that never existed for them, at least not ethnically. So, men wearing jubba, the long thing. That's not Indian or Pakistani dress traditionally, from what I know. It's Middle Eastern. So now we've got a much more eclectic kind of fusion of different sensibilities.
I think they think that it's the Sunnah, isn't it?
Well, yeah. So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that whether it's the Sunnah or not, but yeah, okay, it's the Sunnah, right? But why wasn't that important to people in 1930s India who were Muslim? Or was it? Do you know what I mean? Because it wasn't important to me, wasn't important to my dad, right? So that comes from an externality, doesn't it? That picking up of the sunnah, that sunnah in terms of dress, it comes from elsewhere. It's not transmitted culturally in terms of Pakistani family.
Yeah, there's a mix of culture and religion.
Yeah. But, you know, that's kind of where we are. You know, culture is always changing and evolving. So, you know, you will get people, you'll see it yourselves, right? You know, young women wearing modest clothing and a Calvin Klein headscarf, right? Or men wearing a jubba and Nike trainers, right?
I went to the pub the other day and I had a white kurta pajama on and I sat outside at beer garden. No one looked at me twice.
Did they kick you out?
No.
Why did they kick you out?
No, we were Eid and
I'd have kicked you
I
out.
like white kurta, my mates go, let's go to the pub, we're not doing it. I go, okay. You know, we take that off, I go, pubs have dress code anyway, pard. We're going to a beer garden, no one looked at me twice. Like,
Which pub has a beer garden in Bradford? Beehive?
Most of them
Do
do.
they?
But the one I went to was the one in City Park because it was really hot weather.
Oh, okay.
Sat in City Park.
What do you drink? Do you drink alcohol?
Yeah, I drink alcohol. I drink
What do you
whiskey.
drink?
I love my whiskey.
What do you drink?
Whiskey?
Ah, okay.
I love whiskey.
Puts hairs on your chest. And your
And
top
his
lip.
tash.
Yes,
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah.
I was waiting to get one more in.
Yeah. No, I think there is that whole thing about the jubba stuff. I remember having this conversation with my dad years ago. I'm like, because they were wearing, my dad used to wear salwar kameez in the winter.
Yeah.
I'm like, and then I'm like,
It's like a duvet salwar kameez. You
No,
know, in
no.
the summer it's cool, and in the
It's
winter
not, it's not, it's
warm.
flipping cold.
No, in the winter it's
It's cold.
Nah, it
It's
depends what
cold.
it's made of.
And I said to my dad, I goes, it's not even a sunnah. It's just because it's a salwar kameez,
Mm.
and I don't even think the jubba is a sunnah either, because it's that's not how he would have worn it back in the day,
What do you mean?
in the time of the
How
Prophet.
would you?
They would have probably made it out of different material.
Oh,
or
okay,
different-
yeah, right.
If you really want to go sunnah, let's go back and see what they actually wore. And I was like, why are you wearing that here in the UK? And it kind of, I think when my dad was, was his cultural, this was his
His
heritage.
identity, though.
Yeah, it was
right?
his identity. This is our dress code. I'm Pakistani, and that's why he would wear it. But even in the winter, he'd wear it without flipping long johns underneath. You know about how Baba used to wear long johns.
Yeah.
I used to know.
You'll be wearing them soon.
I remember going to mosque back in the days, and then they'd wear. I remember one of my dad's mates. He'd wear his, his the top, the kameez with a salwar, but then trousers
on top
on
of the
top of the
salwar.
salwar,
Oh wow.
and then he'd come into mosque, take his trousers off, and he'll be wearing salwar kameez.
That's alright, isn't it? Quick change.
Quick change, yeah,
Yeah.
to read namaz.
Yeah, I think that's one word we really. I mean, I know you mentioned it sort of in passing, but identity is one word that's not really been mentioned a lot. Do you know what I mean? I mean, do people? Do you think, other than people who are older, still buy into being South Asian? I mean, and if so, how?
Being Pakistani.
Pakistani, Indian, whatever, Bangladeshi.
Yeah,
Is that important to people?
yeah.
Is that a problem
I think-
within the context
I
of
know,
things like
I
integration? do you think?
think I know. That's true.
Is this that thing of like our parents and grandparents trying to hold on to the heritage, but then in Pakistan people tend to be like more modern in quotation mark, modern than even us.
Moderns.
Modern.
Yeah.
So
like when I say modern, I mean more westernized.
Yeah,
by the
I
way.
know.
That's
So when I was growing up, right, so under the sort of conservative governments of Thatcher, there was one guy, I think he might have been a Home Secretary or something. His name was Norman Tebbit.
Mhm.
And, he was kind of One Nation sort of Tory. And he set the cat among the pigeons around multiculturalism. And he called it, and people started calling this the Tebbit cricket test. Right? And basically he was saying, if England are playing, and they're playing West Indies, Pakistan, India, who do you support? Right?
oh, yeah.
And for him, it was a problem if you, me, any of us said either India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, or whatever, rather than England. Do you know what I mean? So have we got to that? yeah. Do you guys? I mean, do you like cricket? I guess that's the only example I can give. Who do you support, even at the level of token gesture? Is that important to you? Do you feel British? Do you feel English enough to be more that than Pakistani in your cases?
I'll let Alia answer the question.
So I don't watch cricket, but I know that like family around me that do tend to support. Well, actually, they should support India, but they support Pakistan mainly because of like the political
Oh yeah.
goings on in India, and obviously not treating Muslims right. So yeah, they definitely would support Pakistan over England, and I don't think it's that they're a,
Anti-English.
yeah. It's just that it is that part of holding on to that small bit of identity that they can, especially when, again, they've been here for so long. Like both my parents have been to India once, and that's separately. They don't have an attachment to where they're from, so that kind of helps. Gives them that something to hold on to.
What about you, Sheree? What do you think?
I think like that's one of the like problems that a lot of British young South Asians face, is that finding that balance of I'm British but I can't be too British because all the norms and cultures that are being brought up with, it might contradict some of the British values. And I think it's not just culture, that's where like religion and stuff comes in as well.
Yeah. I mean, you could probably say the same for people who aren't brown or Muslims, right? Depends what you mean by. I mean, now we kind of end up talking about what does it mean to be British.
Yeah.
What is Britishness? I mean, what is it? It's probably open to interpretation. And it's very subjective.
I think when I was growing up, my dad always used to say, I used to say, why are you always sending money back home?
Oh yeah.
Do you know what I mean? That whole kind of argument. And then my dad was like, you don't know what's going to happen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I was like, alright, cool.
Yeah.
But I used to think it was stupid.
Exactly the same.
Right? Now I don't know, to be honest.
Right, yeah. I've had that conversation with a lot of my friends as well. We've rehearsed pretty much exactly what you've said. You know, you'd say to your parents, what's the point of sending money? We live here, we're British, you know, we speak English, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, my mum used to say, son, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. They might... Basically, the implication was you could get kicked out, you could get repatriated to a country that you've never seen before. You know, in my case, I'd never been to Pakistan when Mum was still alive. So, but now, probably over the last, well, actually kind of since the early 2000s, people, I'd never thought I'd see it. Never thought I'd hear people worrying about it. And to be honest, there are times when I've worried and I've thought about it. I'm like, shit, I ain't got anywhere in Pakistan. What would I do? Because there have been moments in British politics where you've kind of felt threatened. Yeah. Because you don't even have to be Muslim. You can look Muslim and be Brazilian and you're dead. Yeah. Right? So it's a weird moment. You know, for me, there's been a huge amount of regression compared to where I was in the 80s. You know, things were really terrible in the 80s, economically, in terms of race relations, in terms of racism, Paki bashing, all that stuff. So you think there's been a huge amount of progress. And there has, you know, in terms of not so much Paki bashing now, it's other stuff. And it's much more subtle, I would say, now than it ever was. But in the back of my mind, there's always that lingering doubt.
Yeah, always, isn't it? So, you know, I had a call from Priti Patel because she's going to get rid of Jaffa for that much. Send him to Rwanda.
I think that's where that sense of belonging comes, because if, like, we say we belong here type of thing, then we hear stories of you might have a backup in Pakistan, but then if you go Pakistan, you don't belong there as well, like for...
Yeah.
So what...
But the belonging, I mean, for me, the belonging is really... It's about Bradford. That's a weird thing, I know. I kind of feel more Bradfordian than I do British or English or anything like that. I just feel Bradfordian. Because that gives me a huge amount of flexibility, perhaps, even though it's a much narrower space, isn't it?
Yeah.
An idea as a place. But there have been doubts, you know, as you get older and you have different responsibilities and you need to start thinking toward futures or possible futures, as I said, there have been huge shifts in policy that have really made me feel quite uncomfortable.
So, with the policing bill, they can take away your citizenship
Mm.
if you make a mistake.
Yeah.
Whatever you do.
Yeah,
If it's bad enough, they'll basically take your citizenship away from you.
yeah. It's not
So-
just that. It's like, you know, the way
That and that would only happen to you, but it wouldn't happen to any. It wouldn't happen to
Yeah.
a white person.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of weird and intermingling
So
legislation through things like
Yeah.
prevent, for example, you know, where ordinary sort of rights are stripped away, and they're more likely to be stripped away from very particular types of people. So when you hear politicians talk, they will say, you know, we're talking about extremists in general, for example. But actually, the data show something else. They show greater tendencies for people of BME heritage to be ensnared into that world of mess, really. So, I mean, it's those sorts of things, and then it's political discourse and it's public discourse. You know, people will put on social media these videos of people on a bus shouting racist shit about, you know, people going back to where you come from, and like, you know, the people they're shouting at, born here. What do you mean going back to where I come from? So it's kind of got really nasty. I mean, especially around the period of Brexit, that was like, you know, horrible.
Mm.
Hate crimes went through the roof. And it wasn't just people who were sort of post-colonial immigrant communities, you know, people who'd come in since the 2000s from Europe, Eastern Europe, Africa as well. You know, the level of, hate, I guess, that people felt entitled to be wrong, you know, to be racist, to be mean. It was like 30 or 40 years of work of improving slowly gradual relations has just gone out the window. Bizarre.
Like, do you know, you just mentioned, like, go back where you belong from. Like, Jafar before earlier said, back home, which he referred to Pakistan. So
Is that what you referred to? Back home?
when he said back home,
Back home.
that, like, if
But-
someone else says
but we
to
all
me,
do it though.
yeah, so, like, that's what I mean. Like, someone else says to me, go back home. Like, when I say someone else, maybe, like,
But they mean something else though, don't they? Their go back home is different to Jaffar's back home.
Yeah, but it's like a figure of, I think back home for us is like a figure of speech, because I've
It
only
is.
ever been there like 4 or 5 times.
I've been once.
It home.
I mean, I don't usually say back home, you know, but people do, and it is kind of like ancestral home. You know,
Yeah.
it's not really my home, and chances are for most of us, it probably never will be. You know? But who knows? You know,
Yeah, like, I've got nobody there now. Like my granddad's here.
Yeah.
I've got no family members in
Yeah,
Pakistan.
I've got very, very, very few. I mean, you know, but I mean, the weird thing is, my brother loves Pakistan. He's there all the time. I mean, he goes whenever he gets the chance.
I love it there though.
I love Pakistan.
I didn't mind it, but I mean, I went once 20 odd years ago. It was all right, but
I
my
don't
problem's
mind-
always been the opportunity, I suppose. That's slightly different.
I don't mind, like, I don't want to go to the cities and stuff.
Yeah.
That's not. I hate
Sit in
doing.
the bin, sit
I
on
just
the bus
I
now.
just want to sit in the bin on the manja and
Yeah, that's
smoke
what I do.
hookah
Yeah.
and eat a chili.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I just want to chill. It's so relaxed. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Like, and the weather's good.
There.
So,
I enjoyed that bit
that bit.
more than the day trips out
Yeah, yeah, I
to
don't
wherever.
wanna
I
do day
couldn't.
trips.
I didn't have the energy.
I don't want to see Minari, Pakistan.
But I don't know whether it's
Wait.
somewhere you could actually relocate to, you know, and whether you'd
yeah,
be
the
able
whole
to do that comfortably.
security issue and the kind of economics of it
Yeah,
is a bit difficult.
Exactly.
did you feel like that when you were younger as well? Is it just now that you're a bit
I went to
older?
Madrasa in Pakistan when I was younger.
Oh, yeah,
It's a
okay.
bit different.
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
So this has been Unisalem. I'd like to thank all of us for this interesting conversation. Signing off. Thank you all very much.